Welcome to the Climate Trends podcast. This week, we're bringing you a special mini series that will capture all the latest highlights from COP30 in Belem, where countries are negotiating the next phase of global climate action. And in this episode, we unpack what's happening inside the talks and where India stands in the mix. My name is Manjari, and with me is Archana Chaudhary, who has been very keenly tracking every twist from inside the COP30. Hi, Archana. Curious to know and unpack this together.
Thanks, Manjari. Likewise.
So, what's been India's key message as COP30 kicked off?
So India's message at COP30 is a very firm but pragmatic messaging. It has been consistent over the years, and we're seeing them stick to their stance that climate finance and equity are non-negotiable. So right from day one, India has been emphasizing that any meaningful climate action from developing countries like ours depends on predictable, adequate, and most importantly, concessional finance, not loans, not market tricks. India has underscored the importance of implementation over any new targets being set. So basically, we're saying let's not keep shifting goalposts under existing commitments, especially for finance. Ensure that they are fulfilled, and India is calling for action that matches promises, especially from the developed countries. That's where we are at.
Right, that sounds like a really clear stance. And I'm also hearing that India is once again pushing back against the EU's carbon border tax. And I'm just curious, what kind of response is that getting so far at COP?
India has been saying this from the beginning that EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM as we've been calling it, is a unilateral and unfair trade measure. It's essentially a tariff on carbon intensive products, and India has argued that it punishes developing countries for emissions that are tied into their development stage. So, even though these emissions are a fraction of the historic contributions from the West, the developing countries like India will have to make changes to their industrial systems, which is going to cost them. At COP30, this pushback isn't just from India, though. We're seeing a number of developing countries that are rallying behind this issue. They've called CBAM a form of green protectionism. We've seen that from multiple players. And the response from developed countries has been a bit cagey because some EU delegates have been defending CBAM as a climate aligned trade tool, but there's clearly tension, and it has been becoming a fault line between the global north and south. Although for the first time in Brazil, there is actually a forum that has been created by the host nation to be able to discuss CBAM, because so far the catch-22 with CBAM has been that the EU has resisted discussing CBAM at WTO, calling it a climate measure, but they have also not been willing to discuss CBAM at COPs because that is where it was looked upon as a trade measure. So in that sense, at this COP, there will be some sort of a conversation on CBAM, which is extremely encouraging.
And I also think that we keep running into the same spot with respect to defining climate finance. So, is there a talk again about that, or is it still a bit of a sticky topic?
It's not just bit, it's absolutely one of the thorniest issues for COP30. And basically, at the crux of everything is that countries still can't agree on what counts as climate finance. We don't have a definition for climate finance, and this has been something that is being discussed for more than 10 years now consistently at every COP. More than that, actually, much before Paris even. So there has been questions of should loans count? What about private investments? What is new and additional? So developing countries, including India, are saying that we need a clear, honest definition, first of all, and a definition that reflects whether it's climate finance should come from public grant-based finance, that it should not be repackaged loans or just corporate investments. But the developed countries have often preferred a broader definition, which includes mobilized private finance. And that kind of inflates contributions on paper, but in a sense shifts the responsibility to the private sector. And historically, we've seen that the private sector has not really stepped up with contributions when it comes to climate. And this year also, because we know that there is the Baku to Belem roadmap that was released by Brazil just before the conversations kicked off at COP30. And so that is going to be the crux of discussions at some level. The climate finance debate is now central to shaping the NCQG, or the new collective quantified goal on finance, the 300 billion target that was talked about at Baku. And that what constitutes that 300 billion and how it is to be taken to $1.3 trillion. Those are the discussions that are going to be at the heart of COP30. And unless there's consensus on definitions, the entire system risks being unaccountable, frankly.
Understood. Yeah, we'll be looking forward to how that unravels, I think. I also wanted to discuss with you about India speaking on behalf of the LMDC bloc on day two. Could you tell a little bit about the interventions that India made?
Yes, India has delivered a strong intervention on behalf of the like-minded developing countries. This group has basically reaffirmed that developed countries must take the lead, not just in emissions cuts, but also in delivering climate finance, technology, and capacity building. India has reiterated its stance on the CBDR-RC principle, which is the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. They wanted to remain central to the COP discussions. The intervention also emphasized that any new targets or frameworks that come up should not impose new burdens on developing countries, especially if it doesn't come along with the required support. So, in short, LMDC's message through India was to the developed countries that they need to do their part, they need to pay their dues, and more importantly, there should not be a shifting of responsibility.
And India also demanded more carbon space, is what I was reading, for developing countries. What does that mean? And how did the global north react to that statement?
This is frankly one of the oldest bugbears at COP conversations. Carbon space refers to the amount of emissions that countries can still release while staying within safe global limits. So that is like the upper limit of how much we can pollute or how much we can emit. Basically, the remaining of the entire global carbon budget. As a matter of fact, just today there was a senior scientist who had released an illustration that showed that we probably have cumulative carbon budget left only for about 2 years. And that's a very dire situation that we are at. And India's argument is that developed countries have used most of that space already. So the remaining space must be equitably reserved for developing countries to grow. Essentially, the argument or the fight about carbon space at one level is about justice. It's about saying that without that space to grow, countries like India will face pressure to cut emissions at the cost of economic development, even though they are not historically responsible for the emissions that have gone out. And the response from the global north, it has mostly been uneasy silence. Some countries deflect by talking about net zero for all, but addressing distributional fairness of the remaining carbon budget, so to speak, is not really something that happens. And so while countries are not openly hostile, there is there is a discomfort in discussing this concept.
And I suppose for a conversation like that, there needs to be more unity at the COP. So, just want to also understand about the Global South unity at this COP and how are the countries aligning and what's been India's role so far in that?
So there is a strong sense of global south alignment at COP30, particularly on finance equity, sovereignty over climate decisions. We've seen groups like G77 plus China, LMDC, AOSIS, which is the small island states. They've been coordinating more actively than usual. As a matter of fact, I just saw a photograph of the Chinese delegates and the Indian delegates together, and as part of the G77 plus China meetings. And it's heartening to see that these countries are putting aside their differences otherwise, but are standing together on climate, at least in the first week of COP30. And it's only as negotiations proceed that we see permutations and combinations changing. But at the moment, there seems to be great alignment between all these countries. And India has been seen playing a central role. We've seen India act as a bridge builder, a kind of amplifier, going by what their statement defending the LMDC stance was there. It's using its platform to basically reinforce all the shared positions on how climate finance must be real, just, accessible, on trade measures like CBAM, and that any climate framework must respect developmental needs. And this unity that we're seeing is also visible in how the global south countries are jointly pushing back on things like greenwashing. There's talk of climate colonialism, and of course on opaque private finance replacing public obligations for developed countries to actually help developing countries when it comes to funding transitions.
Exciting, nail biting, all of that.
You
What do
bet.
you think? Yeah, what do you think is the overall mood so far in Belem? Is it aligning, like leaning towards cooperative or tense or optimism or cautious optimism?
I'd say it's a mix. It's it comes across as a mood that is more cautious realism,
Oh,
and
okay.
and there is a sense that everyone knows how high the stakes are. We've
Hmm.
seen climate impacts worsening. We do collectively have a sense that time is running out, but on the ground, there is also palpable frustration, especially from the global south, because key issues like finance and equity keep getting deferred or diluted, and this has been happening for the past few COPs. So, that said, there's also energy. Civil society is vibrant, indigenous voices are more visible, and the host country, Brazil, is trying to steer things towards ambition, although they have faced some criticism on their plans for oil expansion and deforestation. But you can see that there is a colorful and vibrant civil society showing up at this COP. Also, we did see some disruptions a day ago when protesters got entered the COP venue, but it was handled well, and ultimately it also was a sign of how indigenous groups are showing up and they want a bigger say in this process, which is highly democratic at some level. So yes, cooperation is happening, but it's layered. There's tension, especially around historical responsibility and on who foots the climate bill.
Thanks for explaining that so smoothly and so patiently, Archana. I know cops are always a bit of a mixed bag, but we're always keeping our fingers crossed and hoping for the best outcome. So, thanks for explaining everything.
Thank you, Manjari. The pleasure was all mine.
Great, and that's all so far. Early updates from COP30. Please do stay tuned to our podcast, the Climate Trends podcast, for more updates and insights from Belem. Thank you.